pleased to be the Head of School for Politics and International Relations here at the University of Nottingham. I'm very pleased to welcome you all today to the Edward Heath Lecture Series, which is sponsored by the Edward Heath Charitable Foundation, which was started in 2005 to honour the achievements of the Edward Heath legacy. This is a first in a series of lectures that will be taking place at universities across the country, which is designed to bring together practitioners and important commentators to comment on events that pertained to the early part of the 1970s that are still very much with us today. So I'm very pleased to act as the first introducer of the event. So I'm very pleased to introduce our chair of today's event, which is the Right Honourable Lord Ken Clarke, Baron of Nottingham. We are very pleased that he's able to join us. He has a long-standing contribution not only nationally but also locally, where he served as the MP for Rushcliffe, our local constituency, since 1970, which incidentally marks the start of Edward Heath's premiership. So I'm very pleased to introduce Lord Clarke, to introduce our guest speaker today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for that greeting. I'd just say, with the introduction, I'm intrigued to see that I was introduced as Baron Clarke, and Baron Clarke has been carefully put on this notice in front of you, and I apologise for that. The person who organised this, who's a very old friend of mine, has obviously had to listen to me making jokes about the ridiculous title that you have to get when you go to the House of Lords. Baron Clarke of Nottingham, I always say, which sounds just like the sort of guy who gets hissed as he comes on the platform in a pantomime. So don't take it that I have some weird sensitivity about this bizarre and ridiculous title. But that's not the feature of this evening. It's just the first thought that occurred to me when I looked at the wall. And on a more sombre note, I just want to mention, we won't sort of do anything too formal about it, you'd have hated it, but as there are many friends here of Jim Lester, in case you haven't noticed, Jim Lester, who's a very, very old, close friend of mine and political colleague, died a couple of days ago, and I thought I should mention it because we are in his old constituency of Broxton, here on the university campus. And had Jim still been with us, he would undoubtedly, if he was fit, able, would have come to this lecture as a great follower of Michael Heseltine, a great passionate pro-European, represented Broxton for several parliaments, very, very capably and competently in the House of Commons, and was a great believer in the European cause and Britain's place in it, and a very follower of Ted Heath, though he first got elected in the election when Ted got defeated. So he wasn't served when Ted was actually Prime Minister. But it's one way of letting, I think it's quite a number of friends of his are in the audience, letting them know, if they haven't heard the sad news, that we have lost a very good man, very nice man, Jim Lester. And it's my pleasure to introduce another very old friend with whom I've served in governments and parliaments for years and years, Baron Heseltine, better known to us all as Michael Heseltine, and he was, I'm not going to give you his, I think I can remember his full biography. It did not finish with being Prime Minister, that far too many people are described as the best Prime Minister we never had. I think if I had to nominate one, Roy Jenkins might be a competitor, but we missed out by not having Michael. And also, quite apart from what he would have done perhaps to steer the country out of some of its follies of the last 10, 20 years, it would have been fun. But he was a minister in Ted Heath's government, not a parliament, even long ago than I did. And he was a minister in Margaret's government until an historic falling out with her, which I sort of silently, horror watched at the cabinet table as the two of them parted company, but I won't relate the story today. And he was an absolutely key figure in the major government, and without him as John's right-hand man and second in command. That government would not have survived as it did. But there we are. That is the past. Past we reflect on at Edward Heath lectures, and fond memories of Edward Heath, who was a very great man, responsible for taking us into Europe, one of the most difficult men I ever had to deal with, one who I loyally followed. So did Michael. And Michael's taken the theme for his lecture of Europe, Brexit. I look forward to hearing it. Sorry I've taken so long to introduce you, Michael. Michael Heseltine.
I really would like just to add what Ken has said about Jim Lester. Great shock and sadness. I read his obituary in this morning's papers, but he was a good, assiduous member of Parliament and a man of great personal conviction. I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to once again revisit the memory of Ted Heath. I was delighted to deliver the second Ted Heath annual lecture in 2016 in Salisbury. I then covered much of his life and career in some detail, and I don't intend to repeat much of what I said then. My speech tonight will look at Ted, the man, his record, his legacy. Self-evidently, that legacy is centred around our European relationship, and it is not fanciful to suggest that his legacy has been shattered beyond recognition. I do not intend to avoid the question how it was that a Conservative party that joined our country in a partnership with our neighbours across the Channel can, within a generation, have turned its back on such an historic event. Ted was born in 1916 in humble circumstances, the son of a builder and a lady's maid, unrecognisable from the background of those who had led the party so far. His talent, energy and ambition took him along a familiar journey through grammar school and Oxford University into the troubled times of the 1930s. His observation of National Socialism in Germany and the Civil War in Spain ensured he was amongst the first to volunteer in 1939. He knew what we were going to have to fight for. I do not know whether he had read Harold Macmillan's book, The Middle Way, at that time, but undoubtedly he would have shared Macmillan's interpretation of that time, which defined the sort of Conservative party in which he believed. He rose to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in the Royal Artillery, took part in the Normandy landings, and fought through Europe until the end of the war. Like so many of his generation, he was deeply moved by the togetherness of wartime experience which reached across the then very obvious class divisions. The common threat and the hardship it creates forged feelings of mutual respect and interdependence that were to characterize later his political thinking. He was not an easy man. There were no cosy chats or light banter about Ted the politician, and I'm probably understating the reality. I remember complaining to his close colleague, Michael Wolff, about some particularly bruising encounter. Join the club, was his reply. Entertaining in his home in Salisbury, one saw a more relaxed, convivial Ted. Well, even here, care was advisable. I was walking with him in his garden, looking at an attractive vista. I suggested he should find a piece of sculpture as an eye stopper. So commonplace was the put down. I turn now to the record. Much contemporary comment about Ted as a politician consists of comparisons and contrasts with Margaret Thatcher. The latter is portrayed as the great radical reformer, whilst Ted is mired in the failures of wet compromise. To those who lived through those times, this analysis is based on post-event rewrite. Both Lord Deben, who delivered an excellent third lecture in the series, and I said Ted in a very different context. On being elected to Parliament, he climbed the greasy pole. By 1955, he was Macmillan's chief whip, and there followed a series of senior ministerial and cabinet appointments. At that time, when a new leader was needed, there followed a process of consultation that was designed to allow one to emerge. In practice, it was designed to preserve power in the old establishment guard. The emergence of the Earl of Hume as leader in 1963 was the straw that broke the back of such an archaic affront to real choice by members of Parliament. Hume had to renounce his peerage and secure a seat in the House of Commons. He lost the 1964 election, although it is fair to point out that if he could have distributed just 200 votes in constituencies of his choice, he would have won. He was later to become a friend of mine. Ted was the first leader to be elected by his parliamentary colleagues in a secret ballot. He was seen as the future. I remember taking Anne, my fiancée, now my wife, to listen to him talk, advising her that she would hear the voice of our party's future. Ted's election opened up the party to talent from whatever background. His language was that of the meritocracy of which he was so evident an example. Shortly before the 1970 election, he gathered his shadow cabinet together at an hotel called Salisbury Park. A programme of change emerged so radical that its opponents characterised Ted in the image of Selden man. Above all, of course, his voice was that of the Europeans in the party. He had done all he could to achieve Macmillan's reset from imperial to European destiny. De Gaulle's veto was for him simply unfinished business. In office, he led a reforming government. Resale price maintenance, a very courageous reform, the abolition of 1,000 outdated local authorities, and above all, our accession to the European community. The critics made much of the rescue of Rolls-Royce. No serious government would have let such a world-class engineer collapse. The rescue of Upper Clyde shipbuilders is more debatable, but should be seen in the context of the rising unemployment statistics and the still vivid pre-war memories. Ted was appalled at that prospect. The quintupling of the price of oil in 1973 was at the heart of the inflation crisis that hit his government. Almost certainly, the inflationary consequences meant that there was no chance of political recovery from that moment on. This was also the background to the confrontation with the miners in early 1974. It is a matter of conjecture at what time in our history a government should have confronted militancy in the trade unions. Harold Wilson and Barbara Castle took the first tentative step when they produced a white paper in 1969 in place of strife, but no change in the law followed. The trade unions would have nothing to do with it. Ted inherited the problem. His recent wartime experience strongly influenced his search for negotiation in place and in contrast to the civil strife that confrontation would have involved. And in that, he was close to public opinion of the time, which was yet to recognise that confrontation was inevitable. It was only after the destruction of the next Labour government that that mood changed. It remains one of the unanswered questions of history, whether he might have won the 1974 election if he had called the poll earlier, concentrated the campaign on who governs, not delayed, and allow Harold Wilson to catch him in the last week on prices. Wilson served as Prime Minister until April of 1976. Most of his energies were committed to securing support for Ted's Treaty of Accession from a deeply divided Labour Party, which he had introduced as a referendum because he was not able to find any other way to unite his party. We cannot know if he would have been more successful as Prime Minister in dealing with the militancy of the trade unions, because he had retired. His successor, Jim Callaghan, was of course destroyed in the winter of discontent in 1978. Mrs. Thatcher led the Conservative Party to power on the back of that collapse of public order. It is seldom recognised that her government, in its makeup, was effectively Ted's government, given a second chance. We knew what we had to do. There was no division, battle-hardened, we were not going to fail again. But a generation on, the composition of the parliamentary party had shifted. The wartime memories had faded, and no one saw Scargill as someone with whom they had shared a trench in Normandy. I turn now to the legacy. Ted Heath never secured universal support for the new relationship with Europe. 39 Conservative MPs voted against the legislation at its final stage in the Commons. But of course, that only revealed how substantial the majority in favour would have been. It was not the deal Ted had negotiated and which de Gaulle had vetoed in 1963. It was certainly not the deal we could have secured if we had helped to create the community at the Messina Conference in 1956. It is unrealistic to expect anyone to change the rules of a club to allow new members to join. Mrs. Thatcher, however, secured a rebate on our terms of entry early in her first term. Despite the rhetoric and her instinctive dislike of foreigners, by 1986 she had played a formative role in the creation of the single market, which involved the largest sharing of sovereignty in our history. Later, particularly when freed from the responsibility of office, she encouraged the early Eurosceptics. The new equilibrium secured by Ted's treaty sat on shifting sands. Immigration throughout our history has stirred passions in societies as it does across the globe. Ted's personal beliefs surfaced when he sacked Enoch Powell in 1968 for his inflammatory rivers of blood speech. I was the first Conservative to criticise that speech. It was designed to stoke passions without providing any answers to the many questions about immigration control. It was, in that sense, not only racialist, but immoral. I confronted the Conservative Party conference with the issue in 1981 when I said, "We talk of equality of opportunity. What do those words actually mean in the inner cities today? What do they mean to the black communities? We now have large immigrant communities in British cities. Let this party's position be absolutely clear. They are British. They live here. They vote here. However tight the immigration legislation, and in everybody's interest it should be tight, there will be a large black community just as there is today. There are no schemes of significant repatriation that have any moral, social, or political credibility." The Conservative Party to which I belong cheered those words, and a glance at the present cabinet shows how prophetic they were. But they only tell a part of the story. Immigration remains an all too easily exploited issue, which in the early part of the present century became a part of the anti-European dialogue. The Vote Leave campaign did not hold back. Turkey is going to join the EU, and this will overwhelm the National Health Service. That statement was a lie. Alongside this issue, three men played a central role in determining how news was presented by the British media. Rupert Murdoch, a naturalised American, Australian, and Conrad Black, a Canadian, secured control of The Sun, The Times, The News of the World, and The Daily Telegraph. In July of 1992, David English was replaced by Paul Dacre as editor of the Daily Mail. Over the years, the British public were fed a diet of anti-European propaganda. Never far below the surface, and sometimes glaringly above it, It was the message that our sovereignty was being eroded. Foreigners were dictating our behaviour and our freedoms curtailed. John Major felt the force of this, and despite his concessions he negotiated, he only secured the Maastricht Treaty by one vote in the Commons. Bishop Ryder, John's chief whip, and I have different views about how that one was secured. I am convinced I persuaded one colleague into the lobbies after the vote was called and before the doors closed. The bastards have become a central feature of contemporary dialogue. The Conservative Party remained significantly pro-European, but the demands for another referendum were growing by the week. John conceded the concept in the very narrow context that if, as a government, we decided to join the euro after the next election, then that decision would be put to the people in a referendum. Ken, you and I look back on our agreement to that announcement as the worst decision of our careers. The genie was out of the box. The closely defined circumstances were swept aside. There was no going back, and David Cameron made the announcement in February of 2016 there would be an election on June the 23rd that year. 2008 saw the financial crisis headlined by the collapse of Lehman Brothers in the United States. The consequences on people's living standards and expectations were profound and long-lasting. It was this background against which the referendum battle was fought. Foreigners, bureaucrats, immigrants, Brussels, intrusive regulation, featured in speech and headline. The solution to every problem demanded that we take back control. The Brexiteers won. David Cameron felt a personal responsibility and resigned. Theresa May, having articulated the Remain case in considerable detail as Home Secretary, became Prime Minister and put the leading Brexiteers into the key jobs to secure our new relationship. Boris Johnson, the new Foreign Secretary, David Davis, Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, and Liam Fox, the Secretary of State for International Trade. How they would have been spurred on by John Redwood's advice that getting out of Europe can be quick and easy. The UK holds most of the cards. Not quite enough cards, apparently. 1 year later, on June 2017, there was no deal, and the government lost its overall majority in a general election that was designed to strengthen our negotiating position with the Europeans. We have had control now for 2 years, but significantly, 5.5 years have passed since the referendum, in which there has been more than enough time to plan that bonfire of controls that was said to be so damaging to our economy. Mrs May returned to the backbenches, having lost the confidence of her colleagues in the Commons. In 2019, the general election delivered Boris Johnson, her successor, a massive majority. The central promise of the campaign was that it would enable the government to get Brexit done. Boris Johnson explained the advantages that would flow, as he said he would be voting to leave because I want a better deal for the people of this country, to save them money and to take back control. Well, put like that, it has a certain simplistic control appeal. One can be forgiven, however, for wondering if Boris Johnson had any idea what lay in store. As we remember the queues for petrol, our warnings to buy early for Christmas, view the gaps in the supermarket shelves, waiting queues in the doctor's surgeries, beg builders to spare someone to fix the leaking tap or broken window, read that well over 1 million European workers have gone home, and see the containers stacked up at Felixstowe. To be fair, there has been a huge adverse impact of COVID. It is as though that crisis has drawn a curtain across our lives, obscuring all that lies behind. It is the excuse for anything that goes wrong. It was not COVID that sent those European workers home, dismayed our farmers, brought tension back to the seas, persuaded companies to relocate, or failed to penetrate the walls of bureaucracy. COVID would have stretched, yes, the capabilities of any government to the extreme, but nothing reveals the relative nature of its impact on our economy than the assessment last week by the Office of Budget Responsibility that the long-term effects of Brexit were twice as damaging as those of COVID. The attempt by George Eustice, Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, to dismiss these findings as old hat fell rather flat when Nick Robinson on the Today programme pointed out that they had only been published the day before. It is important to remember that Brexit was conceived, designed and secured before COVID entered our vocabulary. In today's Daily Telegraph, I read a headline: "Pound will fall if Britain fails to get more foreign investment." The strategist from Nomura is quoted as saying that inflows by foreign investors have been close to zero over the past few years on a rolling basis. We, of course, have been saved by the cash generated by the takeover of British companies, or as Harold Macmillan put it, selling the family silver. The campaign to leave the European Union was deeply divisive. It played on people's anxieties, fanned their resentments, conjured up memories of an imperial independence long since past. Specifically, it focused on several perennial grievances, sweeping aside the fact that many British fishermen had sold their quotas allocated to them in 1973 to European fleets. Taking back control of our seas was targeted at our fishing industry. I quote the verdict from the National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations. The flags flying over our vessels had a slogan: "Fishing, no sellout." Those flags now seem prescient because that's what happened. The Common Agricultural Policy has been a long-standing target for Eurosceptics, and I must declare an interest. My company has extensive agricultural and horticultural interests. Liz Truss has negotiated deals with Australia and New Zealand that, unlike virtually any other trade deal negotiated as a consequence of Brexit, they are new. They are not simply rollovers of what we had with the European Union. But they have a common factor. They are being phased in over a significant period of time. Well, I've been in politics a long time. I know what that means. Someone is going to get hurt. Kick the hurt down the road and hope it will be lost to sight in the details of an agricultural horizon still shrouded in uncertainty. I turn now to the effect of Brexit on the United Kingdom. We are greater together than ever we could be apart. I come from South Wales. It will always be my home. My eyes fill as the choirs sing. It never occurred to me that Wales would split from the United Kingdom. It was one of the most perverse aspects of Brexit that the very arguments its advocates use to separate from Europe are those the nationalists use to divide the United Kingdom. Brexit fuels separatism. Can anyone today claim that the United Kingdom, its monarchy and its constitution are more secure now that we have got back control? I deplore the prospect of an independent Scotland. Its people have made such a significant contribution to what we are. Human giants in academia, engineering and culture are part of British culture. As a young schoolboy, I made models of the tanks of the Black Watch fighting in the deserts of North Africa. Our defence is their defence. Brexit has handed Nicola Sturgeon one more potent weapon. The Northern Ireland situation is fragile. Debate ranges about the creation and implementation of a border within the United Kingdom that we were told no Prime Minister could contemplate. What the government signed and what their ministers said are incompatible. There is one uncomfortable explanation. Brexit was more important than the truth. British word matters and is a key to our reputation across the world. People must believe that what we sign, we will deliver. I have already referred to the huge number of Europeans who chose to return to their over-regulated, too centralised, Brussels-dominated, sclerotic economies, leaving us with glaring holes in our public services and the private sector. The Prime Minister advocates a high-wage, high-productivity economy, without explaining that the high productivity has to precede the high wages. And this failure has made him the shop steward for every inflationary wage claim that will, over the coming months, lead to growing inflation, rising interest rates, and falling living standards. Not quite the dividend Brexit promised. The City of London had established itself as the preeminent financial European centre. Before Brexit was a serious feature on the political agenda. Under the terms of the single market, its position was unassailable. The Brexit negotiations did not cover these crucial service industries, and companies are now forced to anticipate what discriminatory measures Europeans will adopt to shift part of this lucrative business to the continent. In an article in the Insurance Journal, it is claimed that 440 relocations have been decided, with 135 destined to Dublin, followed by Paris with 102. The prizes are obvious, and we should expect persistent attempts to undermine our market leadership. Of course, there will be those who accuse our former partners as cheats, and worse, ignoring all the while that our talk of creating a Singapore on Thames, slashing taxes and tearing up regulations is designed to achieve precisely that outcome at their expense. This brings me to another of the easy targets of the Brexiteers: regulations, coupled with images of anonymous officials in Brussels. I have some experience with deregulation. John Major, in a flourish at a party conference, called on Tarzan to get out the axe. I set about it with enthusiasm. Amongst my many initiatives, I wrote to every trade association promising to examine any change that conferred new freedoms of competitive advantage to our companies. I received not one reply. And the explanation is simple. The market knows no morality. Left to its own devices, it is a jungle. Everyone for themselves. Civilization depends on the constraints imposed by politicians to protect the weak, impose standards, and frustrate criminals. Yes, regulations are often intrusive and detailed, but that is because long experience has taught officials that design them that there is a small percentage of the population with clever lawyers looking for loopholes they can exploit. Last week, it was revealed we have the dirtiest beaches and rivers in Europe because we allowed the discharge of raw sewage onto them. A group of Conservative MPs forced the government's hand. Regulations will follow. If all those facile claims for deregulation had any validity, the chimneys of Whitehall should today be belching white smoke. At least we can thank the good news that the environment is not being so polluted. I have covered a number of detailed examples of what Brexit has meant. There will be variations up and down in statistics of this sort, but in one important way, the debate should focus elsewhere. Too much of the Remain campaign made the mistake of concentrating on detailed threats that were then all lumped together under Project Fear by its opponents. The argument that attracted too little attention was the extraordinary achievements of the European community in changing the nature of the continent's history. Debate, negotiation, compromise became the essence of political behaviour. 3 wars in 75 years gave birth to the founding vision that it must never happen again, and led to 3/4 of a century of peace. The extremes of politics have been eliminated or marginalised. The communists are now no longer significant in France or Italy. The fascists have disappeared from Spain and Portugal, and the colonels no longer run Greece. 27 nations sharing sovereignty, each with their own liberal democratic accountability as a condition of community membership, have turned their backs on centuries of bloodshed. Their shared political endeavour has levelled up the condition of their people and preserved the countryside. A political entity with the resources to compete with the superpowers of the United States, China, and shortly India. It opens horizons that will be denied to those of us dependent on national resources alone. A British voice at its heart, speaking for generations of young people about the social, commercial, cultural, and environmental world of tomorrow. That was Ted's legacy. For what purpose did we throw it all away? Does Britain stand taller in the world today? Should we not have listened to President Obama when he warned that in seeking a trade deal, we would be at the back of the queue? Our relations with China are clouded by understandable disagreements. European politicians are at the wrong end of name-calling in a war of words that every business person seeking sales or partners in Europe has to overcome. Across the world, there is an incomprehension at what we have done. At home, there is a growing understanding that we were deceived. I have not mentioned Nigel Farage, but I want to allow him the last quotation. In a 52-48 referendum, this would be unfinished business by a long way. He thought, of course, that he was going to lose. And he was preparing for the fight ahead. The last opinion poll I saw showed that that narrow Brexit vote has been replaced by a 10-point lead for those who took the opposite view. I agree, therefore, that it is unfinished business. It will take time. It will require energy and leadership. And here again, there is a lesson to be learnt from the Brexiteers. They never gave up. Our purpose is clear. We must restore Britain's position in the corridors of European power. That is our natural home, where our history is founded and where much of our future will lie. Any vision of that future must be built around the realities of world power. We have so much to contribute. Our tolerance, our fair-mindedness, our political sophistication that has converted colonies into a commonwealth, a reputation of trust with reliable friends. We will play our part more effectively, sharing the power and sovereignty of modern Europe. Every Conservative Prime Minister for whom I have worked since Winston Churchill himself understood this. Ted Heath gave substance to the words. It is sad beyond measure that this government, by contrast, will bequeath to our younger generation an empty chair, voiceless, devoid of influence over European affairs. They will come to reject such a diminished role for our country. Europe will welcome them back.
extremely inspiring lecture. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we now turn to questions. I invite members of the audience to think of questions on Brexit, Ted Heath, don't mind it too much. I was encouraged by the organisers to think that I might occasionally join in, but I will treat them as questions largely to Michael Heseltine, largely because I agree with Michael's views very fundamentally, so by repeating anything he says would be completely odious. So the other thing is there's no microphone for members of the audience. So the idea is that I should repeat the questions when they're said in case people haven't heard them. That presupposes I have heard the questions in the first place. So can I ask Sue to begin and give it some voice so that most people in the room can hear, and I'll try to repeat it if I can. Me?
Yep.
Would you come around the audience? Oh, it's from Michael.
Yeah. Shall I stand up? Or?
Yeah.
Sorry?
Shall I stand up, say what you want?
No, don't need to stand up, just speak up.
Yeah,
Trying to get this microphone taken to you.
You talked a great deal about sovereignty, about how the Brexiteers were arguing that we were going to have sovereignty back from the EU. And you said that it was wrong. I mean, I voted in Remain, but I accept the result, and I'm glad it's over with. But look what's happening at Poland. They're being fined, I believe, not from the EU, €1 million a day, because their Supreme Court went against, said that Polish law was sovereign and supreme over EU. So you talk about sovereignty, but look what's happening to Poland. They are being bullied by the EU, are they not?
No.
Well, the questions, I think, which I heard most of it was, did everybody hear it? The question was, firstly, shouldn't we accept the result of the referendum?
No, it wasn't.
Secondly, have a look at what's happened to Poland, where they're being fined €1 million a day because their Supreme Court said they should not be bound by all European court rulings. Was that really sovereignty, or was not that the kind of control we were trying to reject? Now, I'm sorry I didn't hear all your questions.
No,
it sounds as though you think I paraphrased it
No,
incorrectly. Give it a shout.
No, sorry, what I'm saying is, look what's happening to Poland now. They've tried to assert sovereignty within the EU, they're being punished for it. So you've given the Brexiteers a point by arguing about sovereignty if they can treat their own members like that.
Yeah. I did hear it. I didn't parody it, obviously, you're right. Given what's happening to Poland now, doesn't that prove the arguments about sovereignty were correct that the Brexiteers used? Michael?
Well, the whole point of joining the European Union is to create a bloc of sufficient power and scale to be relevant to the competition we face from the giant economies of America, China, and then India. And if you do that, you are going to have to create a rule. And the rule will say that you have a court of justice which actually determines these issues. I don't find any difficulty in understanding that, because otherwise you haven't got a community at all. What I think the Polish situation reveals is the power of Brexit's arguments. There will always be people who say, give me more power. It's what is separating the United Kingdom, because the Scots are saying it, the Welsh are saying it, there's no growing body in Ireland saying it. I happen to think that that doesn't fit the way the world is changing. But that's a judgment you have to make, because the advantages of being part of Europe are so substantial. You have to have a code of law.
Okay, does that...
Doesn't really answer the question, but I appreciate it.
Well, there is a choice between having a bloc,
right,
which gives Europe power in the world, gives us greater ability to defend our interests,
right,
greater ability to propagate our values,
it's not what I asked.
and having a great free trade agreement. And Margaret Thatcher, not Ted Heath, actually created the single market. The British led on that. And that said, you replace 28 different sets of rules for absolutely everything, power consumption by your vacuum cleaners and all this kind of thing, with one set. You're then able to open trade totally freely to your borders, but there's some compromise. You all have to accept that you have a consensus view. Very rarely it was in a majority view, and there has to be a body which enforces the rules, which is the European Court. And Europe gets stronger when it succeeds in accepting that, and right-wing nationalists in Poland are having difficulty in accepting that, and accepting the other underlying values of democratic Europe, like the independence of the judiciary and so on, which is why I think the Commission is right at the instigation of the Parliament to start putting penalties upon them. But we disagree. The idea that the Polish experience justifies our reducing our role in the world and our voice alongside France and Germany, and renouncing the advantages of trading with the biggest free trade area in the world, which is overwhelmingly our major trading partner. I think the risks of winding up like Poland don't justify doing that.
Okay.
Anyway, I'll now hand to Michael and he can answer.
I just
happen to have the mic. Now, nobody's caught my eye yet, so I'll let you another comeback. Give me a good shout.
I did mention about sovereignty, I think, but then you started to...
Could we perhaps maybe let someone else to speak?
He doesn't understand.
I've got someone to put their hand up.
There's another long, sorry again.
Oh, well, let me take the chap on the aisle here.
If the UK was to rejoin the European Union tomorrow, are you optimistic that our economy could get back to where it was before Brexit was an ideal, before Brexit kind of was voted on?
I think that the one big change would be to eliminate the uncertainty. Investors across the world would know we were part of, Ken has said, the biggest trading bloc in the world, and they could invest safely. I mean, I happen to have been a cabinet minister at the time the Japanese came here with their car industry, particularly. And they didn't come because it was Britain. They came because it was an entry point to Europe. And it's true that they're now looking at all that again, and the government is having to bribe them to stay with lots of taxpayers' money. But the point I quoted in the Daily Telegraph of all people today, talking about inward investment as being flat over a number of years, that is chilling.
Have a microphone. Right, next question. Gentleman here.
Do you think the Conservative Party will ever return to a pro-European stance, or are we seeing a permanent shift?
I think it's very important. One thing we know about the Conservative Party is that it is a party of power. It understands that to win power you have to persuade a majority, and the party swings within its own broad horizons into the central position. It always has, because in the end it is a realistic party. It wants to achieve things and it has to get elected to do that. So my own view is that Brexit is a deception. It was a lie. It was an exploitation of human instincts in a culpable way. When the consequences are clear, and they are already becoming clearer, not yet clearer, because COVID is the curtain which is the excuse, but come the spring of next year, come this time next year, it will all look very different. And I think the public mood will change significantly. Where is the Conservative leader who will say all that? That I do not know. But they will come. There will be somebody now weighing the odds, just like Boris weighed the odds as whether he should go for or against the referendum. There will be somebody saying, is this the moment to strike?
Gentleman right against the far wall, over on my left.
I am a woman, but that's okay.
Now there's a head in front of you. I can only see the top of your head. Now you move, even my failing eyes can see you're a lady. My apologies.
You talked about how British people have been fed a diet of anti-European rhetoric for years now by the likes of the media. Do you see a solution to this, or why is there not more people pushing for a change of regulation in the media and the information that we receive, so this doesn't happen again?
I think you said, do I think the media will change?
What can we do about the power of the media?
What do we do?
So you said yourself that there were lies sold to us.
I think it's highly questionable whether foreign owners should be allowed access to control of the British media. I don't think any other country would allow it, and so that would be my first observation. But there's a very interesting, for those of you who are deeply involved in the European debate, the Daily Telegraph article I referred to today is in their city columns. It's not in the same bulk of the paper. And the same is happening in the Daily Mail, where the city column is now passionately campaigning against the easy takeover of British companies. The main body of the paper is still very anti-European. But it is interesting that this split is emerging in parts of the British media, and I think there's a lesson there, that the bits of the paper have to appeal to a different audience. The financial sections have to appeal to businessmen, and the Brexit effect is much harder and more immediate for those who have to earn their living in the trading world. My guess is that in the end, the body public will influence the political side of the newspapers as well. If public opinion begins to move, the papers will move.
All right. Yes, sir, there. Well, whichever goes first. Yes, the guy in the dark shirt got his hand up first.
This is a bit more of a personal question. What do you two feel makes a good MP?
What do you feel makes a good MP? I heard the question. Michael.
It's very difficult to answer a generalisation about 630 people. People sometimes say to me, I'm thinking of going into politics. And I said, if you're thinking about it, don't do it. It is such a demanding career. And you have to want to do it. You have to be prepared to take the slings and arrows. You have to recognise that almost certainly your life will end in failure, as Enoch Powell once said. You've got to face the long hours, the anti-family tensions that it builds up. But I would say unreservedly some of the best, nicest, most devoted people I've come across have been members of the House of Commons. They know what they're doing, they have convictions, they have integrity, energy, and they keep at it. If I give you one example, you never get an easy decision in politics. If they were easy, someone else would take them. They only get to people like Ken and myself when there's a row and tension. And you deal with those issues, perhaps 6 or 7 a day. You know, it isn't just one issue a day. Your meetings go on and on and on. So every meeting you go into, the chances are that there's something like 60-40 in favour or against on every issue. So in the first meeting, you have friends in the cabinet who join you on one side. The next meeting, the same friends may be on the other side. And think what happens at the end of a day when you've had 6 of these meetings. Well, the sophistication of the process, of course, overrides and creates bonds of friendship within this context. But to the general public, they feel strongly about issues. If you win, well, of course he was right, wasn't he? Of course he was right. Everyone knows he was right. But if you lose, and you're going to lose at least half the occasions, he didn't listen, never hear, you can't rely on him. Because they feel much more strongly of things they're against than they feel about the things they're for. And so, as I say, by the end of the time, we're only in it what we can get out of it. That's what they say. Not altogether true. Very sad. I'm not asking for sympathy.
I will only add that I think it's absolutely essential that we somehow do continue to attract very high quality people into public life. The governing of the country, should attract some of the very best in an all-round sense, people in the country. And I hope young people are not deterred by the ever-increasingly nasty, hurly-burly, knock and tumble. It's just inevitable. You enter politics with the normal sensitivities of a normal, sensitive human being, I'm afraid you have to develop a rhinoceros hide after about the first few years, solely your family a bit, unfortunately, if you're able to survive it. If they don't, we're in terrible trouble. And the other thing is, I hope that we can cure the ridiculous public cynicism about politics and politicians. Because our media is so relentlessly and remorselessly cynical and abusive, and the majority of the public think all their politicians are scoundrels who are only in it for what they can get out of it, and it doesn't really make much difference who you vote for. That is absurdly far away from the truth. Standards of honesty, despite the controversy today, which one of the things going on I don't approve of, but and actually as we speak probably in the House of Commons, with a debate going on, the standards of honesty amongst the great bulk of members of Parliament are far higher than the standards amongst the average member of the public. And the vast majority have gone in because they're interested in what they regard as the public interest. So we've got to get the debate, stop the debate somehow being dominated by people, terribly cynical, dismiss the lot, and also don't want to listen to opinions that disagree with their own, you know. It would do us all good if we went and heard a hardline Eurosceptic tomorrow and listened to him with respect. And that's the way you actually get sensible political dialogue going. Anyway, enough of me now. Nobody up here. So, guy at the front, over the far side.
Hi there. First I'd like to say...
You'll particularly have to shout.
Oh, okay. First I'd like to say fantastic speech. Now, you talk mostly about the European Union. I'm wondering, what is your opinion and thoughts about joining a different union between different countries? In particular, there's like a growing interest in a hypothetical union between Canada, Australia, the UK and New Zealand, known as Canada. Is this a good idea, or do you think we should focus on moving back towards Europe?
Everybody hear it?
Yeah.
The Australian thing. I think so. But what you hope about is you talk about the benefits of the European Union. What about the prospects? The question was, what about the prospects of joining a different union? For example, people advocate a union of Canada, the United States, Australia and New Zealand. Why don't we contemplate a union with those? Let's go back to the 18th century empire. Michael, what's your reaction to that?
Well, what have we got in common that would create the bonds that are necessary to form a united policy on anything? You asked that question. You reveals to you very clearly that such a relationship would be one of a relatively small player against the decisions of the United States. And those are not our common share. We don't share a uniform range of self-interest with the United States.
I mean, I didn't mention the United States, I said the UK instead. So it's just Canada, the UK, New Zealand and Australia.
Oh, Canada, you didn't mention you. No, Canada, Australia, New Zealand.
Yeah.
I did mishear you.
Right. Well, I mean, you've only got to think about the geographic spread to realise that this is not a political union that is realistic. And it wouldn't be very big.
The Canadians wouldn't touch it with a barge.
No.
Because they would alienate themselves from the United States, of which they have a difficult situation of being small but essential allies, totally dependent on their economy. And the Australians and the New Zealanders, modern young Australians, New Zealanders, have to face up to the fact that they are an Asian power in a very dangerous part of the world, and they've got to take a very different, they can obviously want to preserve their own culture, their own politics, their own democratic rights and all the rest of it, but the challenges facing them are how to find a proper role in that very dangerous part of the world, and to pretend their political and economic future lies the other side of the world, 8,000 miles away, is, I think, would be an unwise Australian and New Zealand choice. It would be very greatly mistaken. Indeed, the trade deals we've done with Australia and New Zealand, apart from the really serious problems with what we've conceded, being so desperate to get one, actually won't make a great deal of difference to our trade, just the distance, the sheer shipping costs and so on. I mean, not much will get here, but sheep and cattle and, you know, perhaps the odd chicken crammed together in tiny containers. Right. So, on this above me, on the right to my right. Yes, you with the bottle of water in front of you.
Lord Heseltine, thank you for the talk. You said in your lecture that the natural home of the United Kingdom is with Europe. However, if we look to history, Britain seems to have always seen itself as a island separate from the European continent. Even after World War II, Britain rather relied on the special relationship with the United States for its prestige and eschewed any relationship with Europe. It was only after the consequence of the Suez Crisis that its eyes were turned to the European continent and to any form of European integration. In that view, is Brexit in fact a return to the historical status quo and European integration actually an aberration, a real blip in the history of this country?
For those of you in the far corner, isn't it right that Britain's always seen its actual identity as an island apart from an island country apart from the rest of Europe, and that a natural partner with a special relationship with America, and that actually most of our history we've seen ourselves that way, and we have historically, until really the Suez crisis, not previously ever thought of actually uniting ourselves with the continental European powers. A short, I hope adequate version of the question.
Well, I think that your question in the words you use is misleading, because if you think of 1,000 years of British history, most of it has been tied up with Europe, usually fighting Europe. We were the pioneers of the Industrial Revolution, but what that led to, or we succeeded, was in fact the rivalries of the imperial powers of Europe, whether it was Spain or the Dutch or the French. We were out there fighting our corner to gain more power across the world in competition, often military competition with them. And so the special relationship is born of the Second World War, and undoubtedly the Americans played an absolutely indispensable role. But what people don't so often remember is that America didn't enter the war, the Second World War, of its free will. Hitler, unbelievably, declared war on the United States. And the reason he did it is because he was trying to block the convoys across the Atlantic. There was a cordon sanitaire 200 miles on the east coast of America, so the convoys could disperse, and Hitler wanted his submarines to get inside that. And so, despite Pearl Harbor, it was Hitler who declared war on the United States, which brought them in to war in 1941, 2 years after people like Churchill had been begging, pleading the Americans to come in. They had remembered the First World War, and their isolationist traditions had kept them out. So, whether you look at our religion, or our culture, or our history, it is Europe that has been the founding part. You know, we had kingdoms shared, we had religion shared, we had currency. The pound was brought by the Romans. You know, you've got to see it in the round, in a century-long situation. We even have an invading king, William I. So it's not realistic to think that we are somehow just an island playing a game in the world independent of Europe.
So, yeah, towards the back, in the centre, there, yep, the blue shirt.
Yeah. It's the only way to get rid of the divisions within Parliament that we see at the moment to go to a system of proportional representation.
Proportional representation.
Turkeys don't vote for Christmas. And you're asking the main two political parties to produce a new system, constitutional system, which would break both of them. So you tell me how you persuade them to do it.
I think one of the great strengths of the British system is it disciplines the public as well as the politicians to form coalitions, pre-packed coalitions, which they present to the public, who have to choose, if necessary, the lesser of two evils, but we hope the one they prefer. Michael and I have been in the Conservative Party, both of us, for well over half a century, and some of the other people who've been in the party with us, our fellow Conservatives, have held views rather starkly different to our own. But we've agreed, the Conservative Party, as he said, get together to win power. All over the continent, where their democracy is not working properly, as ours is neither at the moment, they're shattering into multi-party parliaments. The Portuguese government fell 2 days ago. It was always a minority government. It couldn't form a majority in its multi-party parliament. It's fallen. They've called an election. The election will probably produce 7, 8, 9 parties, and most of the commentators don't think it's very likely that anybody will produce a majority government out of that. They're almost paralysed. Now, we're getting very parochial now. We're not Europeans, so we don't know anything about Portugal in this country. But the German situation, post-Merkel, is getting more and more difficult because proportional representation means everybody votes for a particular bee in their bonnet, for a particularly new party that's emerged, and what you really, the country needs, is a government. Politicians have been forced to bang their heads together into a big party before they come along, and electors who've been forced to choose between realistic possibilities. And when it works, it produces a much stronger government system, in my opinion, and obviously also Michael's as well. Well, Guy, right here, you turn around and address your, we'll hear you, so you address your questions to the audience.
It depends on the accent, of course. It's been said by many Brexiteers that thank heavens we weren't in the European Union when it came to our vaccination programme. Do you not think, had we still remained part of Europe, Britain could have led across Europe the vaccination programme and vaccinated quicker many millions more, hundreds of millions more Europeans as well as British?
I think the present situation is that the European anti-COVID campaigns are at least as good as ours, if not better. There was a moment with the Pfizer jab that we had a lead, there's no doubt, but I'm not an expert on this, but all the things I read tell me that the Europeans are more than caught up.
Well, you're all so close together. I don't know how. I'm looking at the far side of the room. The lady with the white, you stand out with the others. I'm just pointing in your direction. It's difficult to identify who is calling. I think it's a lady in white. The lighting is not very good. It's not my eyesight. It is you, yes.
Yes, sorry. I'm just going to ask, who do you think has done more to tarnish the legacy of Edward Heath, Margaret Thatcher or David Cameron, and why?
So can you repeat that? You couldn't possibly remove your mask for a moment, could you? And then give it a good shout.
So who do you think has done more to tarnish the legacy of Edward Heath, Margaret Thatcher or David Cameron, and why?
Who is most tarnished? The legacy of Edward Heath, Margaret Thatcher or David Cameron, and why? Well, Michael, you have a go at that.
Boris Johnson is the answer.
But Margaret Thatcher was not a totally hardline Brexiteer. But Margaret Thatcher was ferociously against anything she thought was political Europe, which Michael and I actually think politics and our role in the world was one of the main reasons for joining. She could not more flatly have disagreed with that. She always saw a plot to create a federal Europe and robbers of our political freedom and all that. She was a very, as Michael tried to serve with her, I served with her throughout. It was a constant problem that. Economic Europe, she was always in favour of. And I always take pleasure in stressing that it was the Thatcher government who led the other Europeans into creating the single market. In fact, we carried on arguing until the very end that it should be extended further to other service industries. And it was the Thatcher government insisted that in order to have a single market, we all had common regulations. We all had a court of justice. The commissioner she appointed, the new commissioner, presided over drafting these regulations. British civil servants are very good at drafting. They actually drafted half the things. You had a vote in the Council of Ministers, but no Brexiteer can find a regulation, accurately describe a regulation, which the British minister ever voted against in the Council of Ministers when asked to approve it. So I can't claim that Margaret Thatcher agreed with Michael Heseltine and me, let alone Ted Heath, on Europe. But the present Brexiteers, the hardline Brexiteers, who signed amazing hardline deals insisting on new trade barriers down the Channel and trade barriers down the Irish Sea, although they have no intention of complying with what they've just agreed with, I think they've done more damage to the legacy of Ted Heath than even Margaret Thatcher did. Indeed, thanks to having colleagues like Michael and myself, I don't think Margaret did much damage to her time in office to our European role, although she did try to sometimes.
Margaret would never have left the European Union.
I never heard her advocate once of leaving the European Union. She accepted the case for staying in the European Union. It only came to her in her very late years when she retired and was in rather a sad state and being taken advantage of by some of her more right-wing friends. Then she suddenly became a pretty all-round Brexiteer. But even if we'd left when she was Prime Minister, she'd have been a soft Brexiteer.
Yeah,
as were some of the Brexiteers I debated in Village Hall, some quite well-known ones, during the referendum campaign. Not all of those thought they were arguing for leaving the single market. This only came up afterwards when they rejected all Theresa's rather convoluted deals which tried to keep the economic advantages of being in.
We have time for one more question.
One more question?
One more question.
I think we try for later. Chap with the blue, nearest two in the middle.
Thank you, Lord Clarke.
And I'll leave this one entirely to Michael, I promise you.
Okay, well, I've got a better one then.
Yes, you'll need a harder one.
Lord Heseltine, how did it feel to be referred to as a wet by Mrs. Thatcher?
How did it feel what?
How does it feel to be called a wet by Mrs. Thatcher? You can speak for both of us. She certainly regarded me as that.
I was the guy who sold the council houses. I was the guy who helped defeat the campaign for nuclear disarmament. And I was the guy that Margaret Thatcher thought would succeed her up until the middle of the 80s. So I'm afraid you're part of the rewrited history.
The Thatcher government is surrounded by mythology, created by people who think they're her supporters at the far right, and people who are her enemies on the left. The Thatcher government was probably the most successful government we've had post-war, with the exception of the Attlee government. But boy, was it complicated, because like the Heath government, it had an extremely complicated person. Well, she was rather simplistically difficult. He was very complicated. Nowadays, most debates about the Thatcher government are quite entertaining. People either love her or hate her, but both, particularly most zealot people, haters and lovers, both sides have created the most extraordinary mythology about what the Thatcher government actually did. And Michael, as he said, was quite a toughie, when the roles he did before he had the eventual falling out over an obscure company somewhere on the south coast, which was a great loss to us all. And Michael, as you can see, was a very formidable politician then and remains now. And I'm not sure that he's lined up to a vote of thanks.
I think it might be me.
Right?
I think it might be me.
Well, it might be, it is you. In that case, I won't carry on just being nice about my old friend, and I'll hand over for a vote of thanks to Michael Heseltine.
Well, on behalf of the School of Politics, I'd like to thank our illustrious speakers for an incredibly informative and very entertaining talk. And so I hope you all will join me in thanking them for joining us. For some wine and eat.
Can I ask one question?
Please.
How many of you think that Britain should rejoin the European Union?
I'm one of the defeatists who thought it wasn't going to happen in my lifetime, you know. On that happy note, drinks next door.